Tonight's presentation, Tulip Fever, all about prebuys. And our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aviation Incorporated. He's author for numerous aviation publications. Mike holds certified flight instructor certificate, A&P mechanic certificate with inspection authorization, 2008 Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, a member of EAA, and an anchor for EAA's weekly webinar series. Mike has been doing these since we've been doing them. And we sure do appreciate it, Mike. Thank you so much for all you do for EAA webinars and helping us all become more knowledgeable aircraft owners and maintainers. So with that, I'm going to turn control over to you.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. And Tim, you didn't have any tulips on your slide, so shame on you.
Gosh, I missed an opportunity there. I'm sorry.
Well, it's kind of a weird title for a presentation, Tulip Fever, but you'll find out why I called it that shortly. But we're going to be talking about let's see here, the market for pre-owned GA airplanes is crazy now. I've never seen anything like it in the 5 decades that I've been paying attention to stuff like this. Some people say it's hotter than a $2 pistol. It's but there's just a huge surge in demand for pre-owned general aviation airplanes, and it's a little hard to understand exactly why. We think it has to do with some pent-up demand generated by COVID, combined with historically low interest rates. It makes it real easy to finance airplanes, and anyway, prices have been going through the roof. And to illustrate that, I want to show you something I found online yesterday when I was preparing for this presentation. This is an ad for a fairly low time 2021 Cirrus SR22T that's on Aircraft Shopper Online, and this airplane is being listed for $1.3 million. Now, I know Cirruses are kind of expensive, but $1.3 million just seemed crazy to me. So I went to the Cirrus page to find out what their price on a new Cirrus was, 2021 Cirrus, and their top of the line GTS, which is what this thing was advertised, is $959,900. Now that's a lot of money, but why somebody would pay a $300,000 premium for an airplane that had 60 hours on it is interesting to think about. And I suspect the reason is because if you order a brand new Cirrus SR22T, I think the lead time on those things is 8 to 10 months. And so if you want one right now, maybe some people are willing to pay a $300,000 premium. Anyway, it just seems crazy to me, and it couldn't help but remind me of the Dutch tulip fever bubble of the 1630s. It's a very famous event in economic history. It was a textbook bubble where the price of tulips were bid up to ridiculous prices and then came crashing down. A lot of people lost fortunes in it, and this just has the same feeling to me. This is an unsustainable thing. But while this has been going on, there has been a kind of a you snooze you lose mentality, and aircraft buyers that they see, what looks like a nice airplane listed online, and they're afraid if they don't snap it up and instantly, it's going to slip through their fingers and somebody else is going to get it. And as a result of this, we've been seeing an increasing number of buyers who are in such a hurry to buy airplanes that they shortcut the prudent due diligence that really ought to be done. And in particular, doing a thorough and independent pre-buy before buying the airplane. Some people will buy an airplane and skip the pre-buy entirely, rely on the fact that the owner is selling this with a fresh annual inspection. Others will consent to owners who say, well, if you want to do a pre-buy, you're going to have to send a mechanic to my hangar and do it in my hangar under my supervision, which pretty much makes the pre-buy not an independent event, and I think kind of corrupt. So people who are in such a hurry to buy airplanes that they cut corners with respect to the pre-buys do so at their own peril. And I wanted to tell you a story about one buyer who came to us for pre-buy and the experience he had, because it's kind of a cautionary tale. I'll call this fellow Chuck. That's not his real name, but he was a first-time airplane buyer, lived in Georgia, been looking for an airplane, had a limited budget, found an airplane that he really liked. It was a 1966 Beach Musketeer. I call them mice, but they're Beach Musketeer. It was based on the east coast of Florida. He had decided he wanted to buy this airplane. And now, normally when somebody approaches us for pre-buy, we ask them to let us review the logbooks first before they make an offer on the airplane. We do that at no charge. It's called a preliminary logbook review. It's not extensive AD research or anything like that. That's done during the pre-buy. But we want to look through the logbooks of the airplane and just get a general impression of whether this airplane, how it's been maintained, where it's lived, and whether there are any obvious red flags or showstoppers in the logbooks before we go to the expense and the trouble of setting up a pre-buy. But in this case, Chuck was in too much of a hurry to take advantage of our free logbook review service. By the time he contacted us, he had already made an offer on the airplane, had the seller accept his offer. He signed a contract with the seller, and again, we usually like to review these contracts before our pre-buy clients sign the contract to make sure that the contract is fair, because a lot of them aren't. But he'd already signed this contract without letting us review it, and he'd actually gone to Florida and test flew the airplane. And so by the time he came to us, it was very obvious he'd already decided he wanted to buy this airplane. He considered that the pre-buy was sort of a mere formality. He said, I'd flown the airplane, I was happy with it. So he didn't really get off to the right start. It's certainly the way we would like to do things in a more methodical fashion. He said, when I test flight the airplane, I did notice that the brakes were spongy, especially the right brake. The owner said that he had just gotten the plane out of an annual inspection, but he'd take it back to the mechanic and get the spongy brakes corrected. Also noticed that the transponder and altimeter biennial certs were not current. And the owner said he'd gotten that taken care of after the test flight. And also the owner said that he was a student pilot, and he would not be able to ferry the airplane to a different airport, that the pre-buy was going to have to be done on his airport, presumably by his mechanic, which would sort of make it a worthless pre-buy. So at any rate, when Chuck finally came to us after what I think was not the greatest start, we were able to review the logbooks, and one of the interesting things we found when we reviewed the logbooks was that there was an annual inspection sign-off on the engine and propeller in the engine and propeller logbooks, but there was no annual inspection sign-off in the aircraft logbook, which is the one that counts. So were sort of puzzled by that. We told Chuck that we weren't sure that the airplane was actually legal to fly because it didn't seem to have a proper annual inspection sign off. But we identified a really good shop that wasn't too far away. It's 40 miles away from where the airplane was based in West Palm Beach, Florida. It's a shop that had lots of Beechcraft experience and that we had worked with before and that we thought was a pretty trustworthy shop. We called the director of maintenance of the shop, and a guy named Johnny Stinson, who's been around forever, and explained the situation. He agreed that he would perform the pre-buy if we could get the airplane ferried to West Palm Beach. So Chuck asked the Musketeer's owner to have his mechanics sign the needed annual inspection logbook sticker in order to make the airplane legal to fly, and then to arrange to have his flight instructor ferry the airplane to F-45. And ultimately, the owner of the airplane, the student pilot, agreed to do that. Now, meantime, we were kind of worried about this airplane because it had been living outdoors on a tie down in an extreme corrosion risk environment of the Florida coast for more than a decade. And we've had lots of problems with corrosion issues on Florida-based airplanes. And in fact, generally when people come to us and say there's 3 airplanes I'm looking to buy, which one do you think I ought to make an offer on? If one of them's Florida-based airplane, we say, well, don't make an offer on that one, because that's just the fact that it was based in Florida and tied down outdoors is usually a big negative. But in any case, we were kind of concerned about it, so we suggested that we do a really thorough pre-buy on this airplane, and that we would have the shop go through the full Beechcraft's 100-hour inspection checklist. Shop said that it would cost about $2,000 in labor to do that. Chuck said he was okay with doing that, so that's what we asked Johnny Stinson, the director of maintenance of the shop, to do. So at this point, Chuck says to us, by the way, while the airplane is in the shop going through its pre-buy, there's a couple of things I'd like done to the plane. I'd like to have shoulder harnesses installed. I'd like to take the old attitude indicator out and put a new style attitude indicator in, replace the old directional gyro with an HSI. I'd also like to install a JPI EDM 730 engine monitor. Could we ask the pre-buy shop to do this stuff while they have the airplane all opened up for the pre-buy? This is something that we get a lot from pre-buy clients, and it's sort of, indicative of the fact that they've already in their mind decided they're going to buy the airplane. The pre-buys is mere formality. So we reminded Chuck that he didn't own the airplane yet, and it would be completely inappropriate for him to perform any alterations or upgrades to the airplane until he closed the deal on the airplane and actually owned it. So we said we'd ask the shop to give him some estimates on what it would cost to do that stuff, but we certainly couldn't pull the trigger on it because he didn't own the airplane yet. It wasn't his to modify. Anyway, the airplane did get successfully ferried to West Palm Airport, and the shop began the pre-buy on the airplane. And the very first indications we had, the very first day, were pretty positive. They reported back that they did a compression check. The compressions were good. The exhaust valves looked good under the borescope. They were going to send us borescope images, but their impression of the borescope inspection were that the cylinders were in pretty good shape. But 2 days later, the feedback from the shop took a very different tone, and it was clear that they were finding things that they were very concerned about. He said that we're just finishing up the exam. We've already identified 40 significant discrepancies. He says our parts guy has got the discrepancy list, and he's getting prices of parts and be writing up repair estimates for you that we hope to get to you later this afternoon. And true to his word, by the later in that day, he sent us a 40-item discrepancy list with a spreadsheet containing repair estimates for many of the discrepancies. And he said, incidentally, the most recent inspection in the aircraft logbook, that the one that we had told the seller that he needed to get the proper sign off, he said, was signed off by an A&P as a 100-hour inspection rather than by an IA as an annual inspection. So Johnny Stinson is saying, I don't think this airplane is legal to fly. It's technically out of manual, which is kind of what we had told him before the airplane was even ferried there. At any rate, the pre-buy findings reinforced our fears about Florida and corrosion. As I'm providing photos of severely rusted spark plugs, severely rusted and warped brake disc, sagging engine shock mounts, wheel bearings that look like they haven't been packed with grease for a long time. Sent a bunch of photos that looked really ugly and looked like an airplane that had been sitting out on the Florida coast for a long time, and there was just rust everywhere, and those wheel bearings, should have been retired years ago or replaced years ago. And the discrepancy list was pretty eye-opening. Go through some of the highlights of it for you. So the last proper annual inspection on the airplane was signed off 4 years ago, but there was no record of AD compliance in the logbooks for the past 10 years, with 8 recurring ADs identified that there were no record of compliance with. The last engine major overhaul was performed by an individual A&P mechanic, not by a certified engine repair station. Now, it's legal for an individual A&P to overhaul engines, but we get real nervous about that. So that was sort of a strike against the airplane. Heavy corrosion everywhere they looked. Engine cowling, engine intake tubes, engine baffles, fuel filler ports, fuel strainer retention, the fuel strainer retention bolt, spark plugs, brake discs, wheel bearings, and wheel races all had heavy corrosion. Numerous propeller spinner screws were seized with no evidence that the spinner had been removed, despite that there was an annual inspection sign-off in the propeller logbook. So it sounded like more like this annual was pretty much pencil whipped. All 3 landing gear shock strut donuts were severely rotted out. The cost to repair would be almost $10,000 for just that discrepancy alone. All the wheel bearings and races were in terrible shape. You saw the photographs of that. The cost to repair about $1,000. Right brake disc worn beyond limits and corroded. The cost to repair that about $400. Upper engine mounts were sagging and have large gaps in them. The cost to repair that $1,300. Vacuum pump shaft was sheared, oil leaking from the garlock seal. Cost to repair $800. Magnetos have not been overhauled or IRAN for 20 years. They're supposed to be every 500 hours. Cost to overhaul the mags, both mags, $2,200. The whiskey compass was dry. Correction card is missing. So they're going to have to get a new compass and swing the compass. Cost to repair about $300. Both control column guides were broken. Cost to repair $1,300. Both aileron rod ends badly worn. Cost to repair $1,600. The flaps aren't retracting fully. They have to investigate why. All the cabin air controls are seized. Tail strobe is inoperative. Cabin fire extinguisher is missing. We're not quite finished with the checklist, Johnny says. But this may be enough for you to make a decision about this aircraft, which he said in very dry sarcasm, which indeed was the case. So we went over this stuff with Chuck and convinced him that he really didn't want to have anything to do with this airplane. It was absolute catastrophe. And even though he had already purchased it in his head and wanted to upgrade it and do all that stuff, so we advised Johnny the next day that Chuck had decided he was going to walk away from this airplane. Please give us the invoice for the work that you did, and we appreciated the real thorough pre-buy that they did. Please make the airplane ready for flight. The owners have been advised the aircraft appears to be out of annual, and he will need either an appropriately signed inspection sticker or a ferry permit in order to fly the airplane home. Now keep in mind, this Beechcraft Musketeer was represented by the seller as fresh out of an annual inspection. So imagine if Chuck had relied on that rather than conducting the independent pre-buy, which he ultimately did. Chuck was very happy that we saved him from this disaster. He found another airplane that was a purchase candidate within his budget, and he decided this one he would do the right way. So he gave us the logbooks for a preliminary logbook review. This was a 65 Cherokee 180 based in North Carolina. And it was a nice looking airplane. We went through the logbooks, didn't turn up any red flags or showstoppers, looked like a well-maintained airplane. We were happy that it was based well inland in North Carolina rather than the Florida coast. That was a good sign. It would have been even better if it had been based in Arizona, but you can't have everything. So we told Chuck that this looked like an airplane that was worth doing a pre-buy on. We found a nearby shop that we thought was competent to do it at Triangle North Executive Airport, North Carolina. The director of maintenance there agreed to perform the pre-buy for $1,800 and go through the full 100-hour annual inspection check or 100-hour inspection checklist. And it took about a week to get the airplane there and get the examination performed. But the airplane came out of that pre-buy with a pretty clean bill of health. And we advised Chuck that there was no good reason that he shouldn't go ahead and buy the airplane. The bore scope inspections said all of the cylinders and valves looked good. The oil filter was clean. The magnetos were due for 500-hour inspections, but the seller agreed to pick up the cost of doing the 500-hour IRAN. So we recommended that he move forward and close on the airplane, which he did, and flew it home and has been flying it at least weekly ever since. So this near disaster wound up with a happy ending. I don't know what ever happened to that Beech Musketeer, but it was very fortunate that Chuck didn't buy it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I just want to emphasize the fact that even though the market is hot, and even though people are afraid that airplanes are going to slip through their fingers, you really, really need to be serious about doing an independent pre-buy at a good shop. Typically means ferrying the airplane somewhere other than its home airport to get it out of the seller sphere of influence and into an independent shop that can do a good job. And with that, Tim, we can just open it up for some discussion.
All right, Mike. Thank you. We got a couple of questions here. Wow, what a story! Holy cow! Yeah, buyer beware. Pre-buy inspection is
Saved from the jaws of disaster.
so valuable to do pre-buys like that with a good independent service like you have. So starting off with Stephen, he just wondered, do you have any recommendations for purchasing an interest in a club-owned plane, assuming 10 to 12 member owners?
Well, I know that we have managed pre-buys for people who are buying a part interest in an airplane. Typically it's less than 10 owners. And they're usually fairly expensive airplanes, like somebody's buying maybe a 1/3 interest in a Piper Malibu or something like that. I don't know whether you could really justify the cost of doing a pre-buy when you're getting a 1/10 interest in a flying club. But you should, at the very least, have somebody go through the logbooks carefully and get a, you can learn a lot from going through the logbooks. You can learn, first of all, how the airplane was maintained, how actively or inactively it's been used, where it's spent its life, whether it's been, living in a dry climate or living in a high corrosion area. Corrosion is just one of the worst problems that we see with used airplanes, and there's an awful lot of airplanes that I think Florida is probably the number 2 most populous state for GA aircraft. So you see a lot of airplanes from Florida advertised, and they're not necessarily bad if they've been flying a lot, and if they've been hangared, they're probably going to be okay. If they've spent a lot of inactive time and they've spent it outdoors, particularly if they're located near the coast, it can be a pretty serious problem. And this Musketeer is a perfect example of that. So at the very minimum, I would say, get a preliminary logbook review, and my company does those at no cost. Now, this isn't a detailed logbook review; it's not AD research and stuff. But we basically go through it and just get a general impression of where the airplane lived, how it's been maintained, who's been maintaining it, whether all of the necessary sign-offs are present. And you can tell quite a lot. I mean, you get that it's not a substitute for a pre-buy, but it's sort of I think a necessary prerequisite, and we do it at no cost. So
Mark wonders, what's the biggest red flags you look for in the logbooks?
well, I mean, it depends on what kind of aircraft it is. I mean, for example, if somebody's looking for a Cirrus, there are all kinds of life-limited parts. The parachute is due every 10 years, I think. The seatbelt inflators are due every 8 years. The reefing line cutters, and these are airworthiness limitations. They're not suggestions. They're not like a Magneto 500-hour IRAN, which is recommended, but it's not required. But these things are all required, and some of them, like the parachute repacks, very, very expensive. So we look for stuff like that. We want to see the airplane being flown regularly, because the pretty much the worst thing you do with an airplane is let it sit. And if you have to let it sit, and you're letting it sit in New Mexico or or Colorado or something, then it's probably okay. But if it's in coastal California or coastal Florida or uh, Boston or something like that, then periods of inactivity become extremely significant. So inactivity, and one of the things we see a lot is airplanes that are put up for sale that have a recent period of inactivity. They're put up for sale because something bad happened. The owner got sick and couldn't fly. The owner had a divorce, or all sorts of stuff that happens like that. We also want to make sure that the logbooks are complete, because if there's a lot of missing logbooks, I mean, we run into all sorts of things where logbooks were lost. Well, I remember one case where guy got divorced, and the wife threw a bunch of the logbooks in the fireplace. It's just because it's to be mean. And if there's missing logbooks, that can be serious problems, because if you can't substantiate that certain airworthiness directives were complied with, they may have to be complied with over again, and that can get expensive. So those are all the kinds of things that we look for in a preliminary logbook review.
Jake wonders, how far back do you recommend looking back in the logbooks, thinking of a plane like 1940s build, 1950s?
Well, of course, we mostly focus on the more recent stuff because, for example, we're not interested in what happened to the engine prior to its most recent overhaul, because that's kind of irrelevant. And we definitely want to take a really close look at the last 5 years or so. But if the logs go back further than that, we'll scan through them just to get a general idea where the airplane lived and so on. But I think we tend to put the greatest emphasis on, say, the last 5 years or so of maintenance records.
Terry wonders, does this, he said the last annual he had his IA only signed the airframe logbook for the annual inspection, and does the
That's
engine and
fine.
prop logbook also have to be signed, or?
They don't. In fact, there's actually no requirement for there even to be an engine and prop logbook. That's something that's done by as a more of a tradition, but it's not a requirement. But the only kind of annual inspection there is an annual inspection on an aircraft, and it has to include everything in the aircraft, including the engine and the propeller and the airframe and all the appliances and so on. So the only annual inspection logbook entry that really counts is the one that's in the aircraft logbook. When I sign off an annual on my airplane, and by the way, I'm in a very good mood today because I just finished the annual today.
Hey, all right,
I love it when
congratulations.
I finish it. I was supposed to finish it last week and ran into a little problem and that delayed me, but I got it finished today. But when I sign off an annual on my own airplane, I sign off an annual inspection entry in the airframe in the aircraft logbook, and then I sign off basically 100-hour inspection on the engine and 100 engines because I have two, and 100-hour inspections on the props. But those aren't actually required. It's just it's more of a tradition. But the one that really counts is the one in the aircraft logbook.
David wonders, how do prebuys on experimental aircraft differ from an aircraft with a standard airworthiness certificate?
Well, mostly they differ because it's harder to find shops that are willing to do them. We if it's a pretty standard experimental, if it's an RV or something, we usually don't have too much trouble finding shops that are willing to work on it. If it's a more unusual experimental, sometimes it's difficult to find, first of all, shops that are willing to do pre-buys, and second of all, it can be very difficult to find shops that have any expertise in that particular make and model.
A little commentary from Edward. He says, I recently purchased my first aircraft, a 2011 Sonex, without a pre-buy. He bought it for $21K. I thought it looked good. The airframe was fine, but the mysterious oil leak was coming from a nearly invisible crack in the crankcase.
Oh,
The condition inspection, $6,000 later in parts and labor to fix it.
Yeah.
And so this webinar helped a lot to being more knowledgeable, he says, when he buys his next faster plane.
Yeah, I remember we did a pre-buy on a Cirrus SR20 a few years ago, and found a crack in the crankcase, and the seller wound up having to pay for the engine tear down instead of the buyer. So that was it's very important to find. When we do pre-buys, the real focus is on the big ticket stuff. We don't usually go through the entire 100-hour inspection checklist. I mean, we don't really care if the cable tensions are correct or anything like that for a pre-buy, because that's you know not something that would either cause the buyer to walk away from the airplane because it's simple to cure and inexpensive to cure, and it isn't something that would trigger a price renegotiation. So there's a lot of stuff that's on an annual inspection checklist that we typically don't worry about doing during a pre-buy. But there's stuff that isn't on annual inspection checklist that we do worry about. For example, if the engine has had a significant period of disuse, we're really worried about the cam and lifters and stuff. And if it's a Continental, we will often have some lifters pulled so that we can look at them and take a look at the cam. Can't do that on a light combing. Sometimes you can look at the cam with a skinny flexible bore scope, but with Continentals you can pull the lifters pretty easily and get a good look at the cam lobes and get a good look at the lifters. And we don't do that on every pre-buy, but if the logbooks indicate that the airplane has had a significant period of disuse in an area where the corrosion risk is significant, then we'll want to do something like that, which is not something you'd ever do on an annual, because it's typically, in the normal course of doing things, the only time you find out about cam and lifter spalling is if you wind up with ferrous metal in the filter, or if somebody pulls a cylinder and sticks their head in the hole. But we don't normally go looking for that kind of problem, because cam and lifter spalling, has never called anybody to fall out of the sky. It's what I call a safety of wallet issue rather than a safety of flight issue. But in a pre-buy, it's very important because it's a big cost item, and it's a question of whether the seller is going to pay for it or whether the buyer is going to pay for it. So it becomes very important in a pre-buy, even though it's not something you do during an annual.
A few people are kind of wondering where you see the market going in the future. For example, Ken's question kind of summarized it with the inflation very high, economy being unstable right now. Do you see the market slowing, or prices keep increasing or stabilizing?
Well, I'm not an expert on that sort of thing. I'm not an aircraft appraiser, and I'm not Karnak the Magnificent. I can't really see the future, but I mean, common sense would suggest that that this thing this market has been overinflated, and the fact that interest rates are going to rise has got to put a damper on some of that. And I'm also guessing that there's been a whole lot of pent up COVID related money that's getting spent, but that's not something that's going to be a long term situation. So I have to assume that the market is going to return to something closer to normal. I don't know how fast that's going to happen, but that seems logical that that's going to happen. And hopefully that means people will be taking a more thoughtful approach to buying and a less panicky one, worrying about the airplane's going to slip through their fingers if they don't buy it right this minute.
There's always another one out there. Just got to be patient, right?
Yeah, well, I have a theory that you always buy the third airplane that you
The
look
third
at.
airplane. Oh, that's good to know.
I don't know why, but I
Al
just
is
thought I'd
wondering.
throw that out.
Al's wondering, what's an average cost of a pre-buy?
Well, I mean, obviously depends on what kind of airplane it is. But for the kind of airplanes we were talking about here, a Cherokee 180 or a Musketeer, figure on maybe $1,500 to $2,000 in shop labor. And when we manage a pre-buy, we typically for a single engine piston airplane, we charge a flat management fee of $750, and that doesn't include what the shop's invoice is going to be for the labor. And we try to structure the pre-buys in phases so that we will catch the big red flag items early, and if the airplanes is a huge problem, we're going to want to pull the plug on the pre-buy as early as possible and not spend any more money than necessary. Looking at it, if the airplane is an older airplane, there's a fair chance that the pre-buy will turn up something bad enough that the buyer will want to walk away from it, the way that happened with this Musketeer. If the airplane is a relatively young airplane, then the likelihood is very high that the transaction, that the sale will take place, and the pre-buy really it really only influences what the final sale price is going to be. Because if the pre-buy identifies airworthiness issues, then the seller should reduce the price appropriately to compensate the seller for having to deal with those airworthiness issues. Our theory is that if you buy a used airplane, you're not entitled to a perfect airplane. If you want a perfect airplane, you should buy a new one, but you are entitled to an airworthy airplane. And so our basic philosophy is the seller should pay for airworthiness items. The buyer should pay for anything that's not an airworthiness item. And the definition of an airworthiness item is one that would prevent a shop from signing off an annual inspection as airworthy. So it has to be fairly significant to count as an airworthiness item. But if we identify airworthiness items, then we try to get the seller to agree to pay the cost to correct those. And the best way to do that is to get them to lower their price by the amount that it's going to cost the seller it's going to cost the buyer to correct the problem.
A few questions here about logbooks and reviewing them. Carol's wondering, I've been nervous about having a potential buyer, quote unquote, take aircraft logbooks to review. I've generally asked them to review the books at my field. Am I being overly cautious, or should I not be worried? I've been told that once the logs are lost, the plane sale value has just plummeted.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up. Our position on logbooks is that the logbooks should never leave the custody and control of the aircraft owner. And that includes never giving the logbooks to a shop or a mechanic. When a client signs up for managed maintenance with our company, the first thing we make sure it gets done is that the logbooks get scanned electronically. We maintain electronic copies of the logbooks as PDF files. We make those files available to whoever needs to look at the logbooks, including shops and mechanics. And in some cases, if there's an accident or incident or something, the FAA may want to look at the logbooks, but we would not even give the FAA access to the physical logbooks, and they don't need them. The copies are all that they need. So we recommend that owners lock up their logbooks in a fireproof safe somewhere and never allow anybody else to have access to them. And by the way, along the same lines, we recommend that all maintenance record entries that shops and mechanics make are made on self-adhesive stickers, and that go to the owner, and the owner gets to paste them into the physical logbooks, not the shop. We don't want to have the shop have any access to the logbooks. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. One reason is that sometimes shops make nasty logbook entries, and if a shop makes a nasty logbook entry, we want to be able to send it back to the shop and say this is unacceptable, redo it. Or not necessarily even nasty, but just wrong. I mean, they may sign off an AD the wrong way, so it's it's not legal. This Musketeer's perfect example where the annual inspection was signed off wrong. And if the maintenance record entries are made on self-adhesive stickers, you can send them back to the shop and say redo them. But if they write them right in the logbooks, it's pretty hard to, pretty hard to do. Another reason we don't want shops to have physical access to the logbooks is if there's a dispute over an invoice, shops have a tendency to want to hold the logbooks hostage. And we don't want that ever to happen. So the best way to not let that happen is to never let them have access to the physical logbook. So our advice is always for owners to maintain sole custody and control of the logbooks, keep them locked up in a nice safe place, and don't let anybody else ever have them. The only time the logbooks should be transferred is if they sell the airplane, then the logbooks legally have to be sent to pass to the new owner, which only makes sense. But we recommend never letting anybody have access to the physical logbooks.
Sounds like we should all have an electronic PDF copy of our aircraft logbooks. And it should be up to date,
Absolutely.
I guess. After each year and
Yeah.
each annual, it needs to be updated with that new endorsement added to that electronic file.
Yeah. And oh, by the way, never carry logbooks in the airplane, ever. I mean, again, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. If the airplane has an accident, the NTSB does not want the logbooks to burn up with the airplane. If you get ramp checked, you don't want to have logbooks in the airplane that the FAA inspector can look at. If he wants to look at the logbooks, you tell him, well, let's make a mutually convenient appointment for you to look at them, and then you go over and make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and stuff before the FAA gets to look at them. And oh, by the way, most logbook entries are only required by regulation to be kept for 1 year. So I'm not saying you should only keep them for 1 year. We want nice complete logbooks. But if the FAA wants to see the logbooks, you should only provide the FAA with the logbook entries that you are legally required to have, which for most logbook entries are only the last year's worth. And again, these are all good reasons to never let the physical logbooks out of your possession and only provide electronic copies to people who need to look at them.
Stephen was wondering, comment, the preliminary logbook review by your company could be made less confusing. I have missed out on a couple of deals because I could not download or send the photocopies in the order which you require. Can you make it simpler?
Well,
Mm.
I thought we made it pretty simple. But what we're not willing to do is, and this is the reason that we set some rules for how logbooks are submitted. But we're not interested in getting 750 JPEG files of pages that were shot with an iPhone camera or something like that. We want the logbooks in a PDF format in a logical order, because we don't want to have to do a huge amount of work to assemble a lot of pieces. If we do the logbook review at no cost, so the work of organizing the logbooks needs to be done by whoever is submitting them to us.
Is there a tip or a trick for assembling that file that is acceptable to work in your system? Like,
Well,
how would one do that? I mean, do you go to Kinko's, or how do you do that?
Well, look, it's normally the seller's job to do that, and in today's world, where the way you sell airplanes is to list them online at Controller or Aircraft Shopper Online or Trade a Plane Online or one of those sites, one of the things sellers need to do is to scan their logbooks into PDF files and make them available online in their listings. And most serious sellers do that. But if you have a seller who hasn't done that, you have to get the seller to take their logbooks, like you say, down to their FedEx office, or I don't think they're called Kinko's anymore,
Hmm.
but or Staples or any of the office kinds of stores that do scanning. And they typically charge $1 a page or something to scan it, or if you have a scanner at home, you can scan them yourself. But that's really the seller's job to do that. Any seller that isn't willing to scan their logbooks into electronic form so that buyers can review them is not a serious seller.
Let's see here. So, oh, this is a good one. William's wondering, Mike, do you see any problem with duplicate logbook stickers, i.e. duplicate stickers attached to engine and airframe logbooks? So if one logbook becomes lost or severely damaged, backup entries are available at the remaining logbook.
No, I don't see any problem with that. Again, by the regulations specify what needs to be in maintenance record entries, but they're silent on what the form of those entries are. They only talk about the content. So maintenance record entries can be like, I maintain my maintenance record entries in a Microsoft Word file, and I keep it in the cloud so that it's not going to get lost even if my computer goes up in smoke. And it's perfectly legal. You can keep them on 3x5 cards if you want to. You can keep on Post-it notes on a wall if you wanted to. Probably not a really practical idea, but the FAA doesn't care how you keep them. They only care what's in them. And when we review them, the main thing we care about is that they're in some sort of reasonable chronological order, so that they're not all, like a shuffle deck of playing cards, because that gets really confusing to try to. Because we're trying to look through the logbooks and get kind of a narrative of what the history of this airplane is, and so if they're not in chronological order, it makes it very difficult to do that.
Ken wonders, do you ever get into a discussion where the pre-buy mechanic says something is an airworthiness issue and the seller's mechanic argues it is not an airworthiness issue? And how do you settle such a dispute?
Well, that never happens, because the seller's mechanic is never part of the conversation. That's one of the reasons that if a seller insists on the pre-buy being done, under in his premises or under his control or with his mechanic present, we simply won't participate. We tell our client, just find another airplane to buy. And if they really want to buy it, we say, fine, buy it with our blessing, but we're not going to have anything to do with the transaction, because the only kind of pre-buy that's worth anything is a pre-buy that the seller has no influence over. And so we almost always require that the airplane be ferried to another airport at a shop that has no prior relationship with the aircraft or with the seller. And if there's a broker involved, no prior relationship with the broker, because the pre-buy really needs to be independent, and it needs to be done strictly for the buyer's benefit. Buyer's paying for it, and it should be strictly for the buyer's benefit, and the seller shouldn't have anything to do with it. Now, sellers typically aren't willing to have their airplanes ferried halfway across the country for pre-buy, because they don't know if the buyer is serious, if he's a tire kicker or what. So our general guideline is that we want the seller to agree in the agreement that the seller and buyer sign with one another that the buyer has the right to do a pre-buy by any shop or mechanic of his choice within 1 hour's flying time of where the aircraft is based. And if we try to do it a little closer than that, but that we feel an hour's flying time away is a reasonable radius that the seller should be willing to agree to. And that typically gives us enough choices of shops. One of the big problems with doing pre-buys, and we manage a lot of pre-buys, we've done thousands and thousands of pre-buys, is that it's really hard to get a pre-buy on a shop on the schedule of a decent shop, because most shops nowadays are booked up with annual inspections and stuff for their regular customers out for months in advance, and pre-buys can't wait months. The seller isn't gonna take his airplane off the market for a period of months waiting for a pre-buy to occur. So one of the things that we have to do is we typically have to call a whole bunch of shops and try to find one that's willing to shoehorn the pre-buy in a reasonable amount of time, which is not easy. And that's one of the reasons that we need that 1 hour radius kind of thing, because it gives us a choice of shops, and we typically have to contact a bunch of shops to find one that can accommodate the pre-buy in the time frame that is necessary.
Irvin is asking, is the total number of hours on an airframe alone a reason to avoid buying, for instance, 11,800 hours on a Cherokee 180?
Not necessarily. There are some airplanes where we've seen spectacularly large number of hours without problems. Typically, like the strut braced high wing Cessnas and stuff seem to last forever if they don't aren't allowed to corrode. And there's just I don't think there's ever been a structural failure of a airplane like that. Cantilever wing airplanes are a little bit more of a problem, because when they get to very high time, sometimes there are problems with fatigue cracking of the spar or the spar carry through structure. Witness some of the recent ADs on various kinds of low wing airplanes that require pretty expensive inspections for cracks and stuff like that. There were recently ones that affected PA-28s, PA-32s, having to do with wing bolts and really the holes that the wing bolts go through. So it really depends on the kind of aircraft. If it's a Cessna 182, as long as the airframe is corrosion free, we don't really care how many hours are on it. If it's a low wing cantilever or type air, or even a high wing cantilever airplane that isn't strut braced, then there may be some issues with extremely high time. And there's always concern about corrosion, but some airplanes have an immense amount of time and are corrosion free because they lived in a nice environment that didn't have very high corrosion risk. And other airplanes, get corroded when they don't have terribly high time on them because they just lived in a bad place and they weren't flown regularly, and then they sat outside and all the things that are tough on airplanes. And some airplanes don't do as well with corrosion as others. For example, single engine Cessnas that were built before 1994 basically had no internal corrosion proofing whatsoever. No zinc chromate, no nothing. Unless you order them as a seaplane, they got chromated then. But other than that, single engine Cessnas had no internal corrosion at all, protection at all. So we worry about those airplanes you look at a Beach Bonanza, it has pretty good internal corrosion protection, so it's less vulnerable to corrosion problems.
Let's see here. Ewan was just wondering, can you do a pre-buy on a Canadian registered airplane located in Canada?
Yeah, we've done that. We've done that.
And Fran is wondering, if the aircraft is damaged in a pre-buy, who pays for making it right?
Well, that's an interesting question. If it's damaged by the shop should make it right. But it ultimately, I think, would be the responsibility of the buyer, because the buyer is the one that's in control of that pre-buy. But we would want to make the shop responsible, and if the worst came to worst, we'd make a claim against the shop's liability insurance.
Joseph is asking, along all the pre-buys you oversee, are you able to comment on how many are acceptable versus returned to the seller?
Well, certainly the vast majority of the pre-buys that we get involved with result in a sale. And they often result in a renegotiation of the price based on what was found in the pre-buy. It's less common to, not unknown, but it's less common to run into a situation like this Musketeer that was just like a walkaway. It was so terrible that it was just uneconomical to repair, and it wasn't a matter of price negotiation. It was just like, this airplane is a disaster. It happens. It happens more with older airplanes than with younger airplanes. But certainly the great majority of the pre-buys that we manage do wind up in a sale. Can't give you a specific percentage. And as I said, it kind of depends on the age of the airplane, what the likelihood of a walkaway is. But it's not something that happens a lot.
So the story tonight is very rare, then, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean the frankly, the story with the Musketeer wouldn't have happened had Chuck not cut a bunch of corners at the beginning, and come to us, with an already a contract signed with the seller, because we like to do a preliminary look at the logbooks and stuff, and just looking at the logbooks, it would have been clear that this airplane was not a great candidate, and we probably would have recommended that he not do a pre-buy on it. But by the time he came to us, he'd already signed a contract, and he wanted to buy this airplane. He didn't realize what a disaster it was. And it was lucky that he did have the pre-buy done, rather than rely on the seller's representation that it was out of a fresh annual, because it was clearly a pencil whipped annual. It was almost worse than a pencil whipped annual. And that's the risk you take if you don't do an independent pre-buy.
Morris wonders, why don't we all move to online logbooks similar to the EAA Builder's Log, which is online? That would skip the scanning for paper to PDF and solve all those issues. Seems there's no logic to paper at all. Skip the stickers as well.
I agree. I mean, like I say, that's what I do for my own airplane. My logbook entries are in a Microsoft Word file. If somebody wants a hard copy, I'll print it out for them. But I maintain my logbooks online in the cloud, in nice where they're safe.
So can you do like electronic signatures too then, or does it have to be basically paper for the signature to be captured and then it's just scanned into electronic, or can it truly be 100% electronic?
It can be 100% electronic, and there is an advisory circular about that, and an advisory circulars are not regulatory, but there is an advisory circular about that. There's a company called it'll come to me, but there's a company that actually specializes in maintaining electronic logbooks for aircraft owners. Plain Logics, I think, is the name of it, if I'm thinking right, with an X on the end. And they're what they charge for their services. They have several levels of services, but it's not unreasonable. And they keep all the logs online and maintain them in an orderly fashion and make them available to whoever needs them. And that's really the way things ought to be done, I think. I totally agree with the questioner that paper logbooks are an anachronism in today's world.
Phil wonders, as a seller, should I get your pre-buy in place before I even advertise this aircraft?
I'm not sure I understand the question. My company always represents buyers in these transactions, not sellers. Sellers are often represented by brokers, but we, what my company is, our involvement is strictly to work with buyers. So I'm not really sure what the questioner has in mind.
I think that answered it.
Drop me an email and I'd be glad to.
John was wondering, do the composite airplanes, Cirrus, Columbia, etc., show any advantage regarding corrosion history?
Well, obviously, a composite airplane, there's less things that can corrode. We're still very concerned about corrosion of the engines, of course, and the engine's probably the most important single part of the pre-buy because it's frequently where the big ticket problems occur. And for example, Cirruses in particular, they do have places where we see corrosion problems. The flap hinges on Cirruses, for example, are very vulnerable to corrosion. We've had to replace lots of flap hinges, and it's a moderately nasty job to do that. Cirruses have metal movable control surfaces, even though the majority of the airframe is composite. So there's less concern about corrosion, but there's still concern in certain places of the airframe, and there's always concern with corrosion of the engines, cam and lifter problems, that sort of thing. Get very expensive.
Dennis wonders, can a seller make use of a pre-buys snag list, discrepancy list, if the buyer walks away from the sale?
That's up to the buyer whether he wants to share the results of the pre-buy with the seller. Frequently, the buyer does share the results of the pre-buy with the seller, or at least portions of it, because he wants to use those results as a negotiating lever to get the seller to reduce his price based on what was found in the pre-buy. But the pre-buy is paid for by the buyer. The results should be communicated with the buyer, and it's totally up to the buyer whether he wants to share all, part, or none of the pre-buy findings with the seller. We've also had some situations, they don't come up very often, where somebody wants to do a pre-buy an airplane and he learns from the seller that some other prospective buyer had recently done a pre-buy and wound up walking away from the deal. And the second buyer wants to find out whether the shop that did the pre-buy for the first seller is willing to share their results. And again, that's up to the shop. I think ethically the shop really shouldn't do that, because the first buyer is the one who paid for that inspection, and so the results really ought to be that the person's property, who, intellectual property, who paid for it. But it gets kind of weird sometimes. But generally speaking, the pre-buy is paid for by the prospective buyer, and the results belong to the prospective buyer, and the prospective buyer can share those results with the seller or not as he sees fit.
George is wondering, since the pre-buy cost is substantial, is there a way to gain an advantage by turning the pre-buy into a full annual inspection, so at least you've gained a couple of months of maintenance-free flying if that annual date was coming up in a few months?
Yeah, we do that a lot. That's it. If the pre-buy is successful in resulting in a sale, which it often is, more often than not, and if the annual date is coming up anytime soon, it often makes a lot of sense to convert the pre-buy into an annual, because the airplane's already opened up. A lot of this inspection has already been done, and there's stuff on the annual checklist that isn't on the pre-buy checklist that has to be completed. But it often makes a lot of sense to do that. And certainly in the case of something like that, like the Cherokee, where we actually did a full 100-hour inspection checklist, converting it into an annual would mostly just be some paperwork, and probably involve very little additional cost. So we do that a lot, converting a pre-buy into an annual once the sale is closed.
Bart is wondering, other than corrosion, what are the top most misrepresented items that you find on airplanes nowadays?
Misrepresented. I'm not sure how to answer that. I mean, it certainly is. It's certainly a truism that most sellers think their airplanes are in better shape than they actually are. But I don't think most sellers knowingly misrepresent their airplanes. If they do, then they would be guilty of fraud. I think they misrepresent their airplanes in good faith. They describe them as they actually believe them to be. But I'm not sure that this student pilot who was selling this Musketeer really understood what a disaster of an airplane it was. He obviously had a mechanic who was not competent, maybe not honest and stuff, but I'm not sure it was the seller who misrepresented anything.
Joseph wonders, Mike, could you give an approximation of what you would consider an aircraft not being flown for an extended period of time would be?
Well, again, it depends on where. If an airplane's based in West Palm Beach, Florida, we would like to see it, flown every week or two at least, and particularly if it's not in a hangar. Hangars help. They're not a panacea, but they certainly help. But if the airplane's in Nebraska, we're not nearly as concerned about that. So it's really a function of what the environment is and how much of a problem it is. You know, Florida, Puerto Rico, places like that, it's just corrosion is just a huge, huge problem.
Phil wonders, I would prefer to get everything out into the open before advertising my aircraft for sale. I would buy a pre-buy on my own aircraft to have available to potential buyers. Complete and open honesty. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's very admirable. I don't think anybody's ever asked us to do that, but uh, you know, certainly I agree that you certainly don't want to misrepresent an airplane that's for sale, and um, you know, one of the things I kind of like to see when we're looking at an airplane is that it's not the same signature in the logbook every year. That there have been multiple sets of eyes looking at that airplane, because that tends to be kind of reassuring that you know that the inspections haven't all been corrupt ones, you know. But if the airplane's been signed off by the same mechanic year after year after year after year, then you kind of wonder. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad airplane. It just makes you a little bit more suspicious of it. In the same way, you know, as I mentioned, that the engine was overhauled by an independent A&P rather than by an engine shop. That doesn't necessarily mean he did a bad job overhauling the engine. It just means that you're a little bit more suspicious of it, because you don't know whether he really knew what he was doing or not. Whereas you know, an engine shop, especially one that's well known, pretty sure they know what they're doing.
Well, Mike, great presentation. Thank you so much. Wrapping it up here, looks like we had about 550 people logged in tonight. Thank you all so much for logging in and your great questions. Mike, take a moment and share your closing thoughts with us.
Okay, well, my closing thoughts are the usual ones. If you'd like to get on my mailing list, we send out a lot of interesting maintenance stories. Try to send one out about once a week. We have a monthly newsletter we send out by email. And if you'd like to get on the list and you're not already on the list, the easiest way to get on the list is to text the word SAVVY, SAVVY, to 33777. You just pick up your smartphone and you text SAVVY to 33777, and a little bot will come back and ask you for your email address and put you on the list. Or you can sign up on the savvyaviation.com website, or during the post-webinar survey if you're watching this live rather than on YouTube. You can indicate that you want to be on the list in the post-webinar survey. My 4 books are available where fine books are sold: EAA Bookstore, Aircraft Spruce, and at Amazon, of course. And Manifesto, which is available as an audiobook. I'm working on the audiobook for the engine book right now. But any rate, and if you do have my books and you've read them, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to post a review on Amazon. Always appreciate that. I do a podcast with my colleagues, Colleen Sterling and Paul New. Once it comes out once a month. It comes out on the first of each month. So there's a new episode that just came out a couple days ago. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of those things. And it's a call-in show. So if you have a question that you'd like us to address on the podcast and have a little fun with, send your questions to podcasts@aopa.org, and our producer Ian Twombly who curates these things. If he likes your question, he'll schedule you to participate in our next recording session. We typically record these things about the middle of each month, and then they do the editing and sweetening and everything, and release it on the first of the next month. And finally, the next 3 webinars that I have, the one in June 1st. They're always the first Wednesday of each month. It's called Failure to Rotate. It's about burned exhaust valves and some really interesting things we've learned about why exhaust valve burn, which is not frequently what the conventional wisdom is, and some of the tricks we have of both detecting and resolving burned exhaust valves without pulling cylinders. So that'll be an interesting webinar. The July 6th webinar is called TBO 5000, and it's a story about actually a Cessna 172 with a Lycoming engine that we helped. The Flying Club came to us at 2,000 hours when the engine was a TBO and said, "What should we do?" We said, "Keep flying it and keep monitoring it." And we helped them get that engine to 5,000 hours before they finally replaced it with a factory rebuilt engine. So it's an interesting story. And in August, right after I get back from Oshkosh, hopefully I'm still alive by August 3rd. The webinar is called Annual Disaster. It's going to be a kind of a sad story about a pretty experienced aircraft owner, actually, who bought a twin beach that he wanted to do air tour operations with, and he put it in what he felt was a very reputable twin beach specialty shop, and everything pretty much went to hell. And the airplane it was still in that shop after 15 or 16 months. It's basically the airplane's not flown, and it's a real mess. And I'm going to tell you the story because there are a lot of lessons learned as to what not to do, because we don't want to see things like this happen. And by the time he came to me and told me the story, there wasn't a whole lot we could do to help him, but there was a lot that could have been done to prevent this from happening in the first place. So that's what we're going to be talking about in that webinar. And I hope some of you are going to come to Oshkosh. We've got some really interesting presentations and some new presentations. Paul Colleen and I are going to be doing some joint forums at AirVenture, and we're going to be doing a live episode of our podcast at AirVenture. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So I hope to see some of you guys there. And Tim, that's about all I have to say tonight.
Well, thank you, Mike. Looking forward. You got a great lineup coming, and boy, your Oshkosh forums sound really interesting. So it's hard to believe it's coming up so quickly. What's it, 80 days now till Oshkosh, maybe even 79. It's coming up quick.
Well, I guess my airplane should be flyable now, so I should be able to fly up there.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Mike. And to everybody who tuned in, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.
Night, everybody. Thanks for coming.